Welcome to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast, the podcast where we learn from cybersecurity experts how to stay safe, private, and secure on the cloud and in code. CSCP is hosted by Francesco Cipollone, your cybersecurity friend with a passion for all things cyber and sharing stories of other professionals with you. This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISO and security engineers act fast, prevent burnout, and implement DevSecOps at the speed of cloud. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Cybersecurity and Cloud Podcast. This is your host, Francesco, and today we have the pleasure and the honor to have Chris Russell on the podcast. We've been interacting a little bit on Twitter, and he's well known for his views as well as his training that we're going to touch on the podcast as well. But before we dive in any kind of fitness rant and fitness thread, Chris, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. Yeah, so again, Chris Russell. I'm the CISO at tZERO group. I have a background in managed detection and response. And before that, I was in the military. I was in the intelligence field, actually, as a human intelligence collector. And worked in Intel for 10 plus years, which is a really exciting and kind of fun job. But towards the end, Intel gets a little bit political the higher up you get. And that wasn't really the life I wanted to live. So I, decided, okay, it's time to transition out. But towards the end, a lot of what I was doing was I was recruiting people to get access to networks. Like that was the main thing. I was a human collector, but everything we wanted was on a network or or data or something like that. So it was training on people on installing keyloggers or backdoors or rats or whatever it was we were, or just going in and pulling information. And so in my head, I'm thinking like, this is like so easy and we literally never get caught, that cybersecurity is just abysmal, and that maybe this would be a good field to get into, once I'm done with Intel, because we need to do some work here. And working around classified systems, especially being deployed around the world, I had to set up secure local networks. I had to set up our, reporting mechanisms in remote locations. So I was used to setting up a secure LAN and having access control and locking down devices by MAC address and password stuff for certain databases and role-based access control and least privilege. All these things in Intel are just very ingrained in you. So kind of understanding those and some of the networking fundamentals, going into cybersecurity wasn't a huge leap. I mean, obviously I had to do a lot of, lab work and training, and I went back to school, continuing to go back to school. But the fundamentals and the concepts behind it, I think, are kind of ingrained in most people that have been around classified information anyway for long periods of time. So yeah, that's kind of how I ended up in cybersecurity from starting off in Intel.
Right. And how did you find the transition from the military background, like the tool you mentioned that you were kind of trained on, like secure by default and operationalized fundamental security concept already, but has it been a massive leap or has it been just a natural transition for you?
So there was obviously a bunch of differences between working with the military and working in the corporate environment. Military and the Department of Defense and some of the civilian agencies, everything's very, I'm trying to think of the right word, very critical. It's like getting the right information is very critical. Being accurate is very critical. So, because, ultimately there's people's lives and health and things are actually at stake with this information. Whereas you move to the corporate world and it's a lot more bureaucracy, a little bit more slow paced. And it's, I'm not saying it's not important work, but no one's actually going to shoot at you if you get it wrong, and no one's trying to, kidnap you while you're trying to meet a source. It's just basic corporate. For me, it was a lot easier it's like, oh, I get to do easier stuff and it's way less stressful. But once you're in the corporate world for a while, you kind of forget all that whole previous life and you start to get back ingrained in the normal stresses of, oh, I've got an audit, or, oh, it's time to do access control reviews again. And I start to get that stress build up, and I remind myself, well, you know what? 10 years ago, a stressful day was a lot worse. So I got to put it in perspective and relax a little bit.
Nice. So different level of stress, more corporate stress rather than
But I would say one of the reasons why I think a lot of people that are in law enforcement, military, secret service, a bunch of different disciplines, they do well in cybersecurity because they learn to be calm in moments of like disaster. So incident response, even though I wasn't particularly responsible for response, I was in charge of engineering and then engineering background around our incident response tooling and one of my jobs. Being around that, it wasn't this stressful thing for me. Everyone else, there's an incident, they kind of get, they kind of get stressed out, they kind of get fight or flight. And I'm just thinking like, we just got to do step A. We've got a playbook. So what's step A? What's the next thing we got to do to start fixing this? And then we do that. Okay, what's step B? And to me, I found that having that kind of calm, kind of under pressure mentality really helped my team and people I work with kind of feed off that and go, okay, you know what, it's going to be okay. We don't need to freak out. In the case of managed detection response, if there is an incident and it's a customer, no one wants to tell them bad news, but I'm the guy that goes in and explains exactly what it is, what we got to do. And as long as you've got a plan and you've got all your bases covered, people are pretty reasonable and they don't bite your head off like everyone assumes. So it's one of those things where I think people that have been through high stress environments and situations, when it comes to incident response and normal cybersecurity kind of daily stresses, you start, you do see it with some perspective and you go, you know what, I don't need to freak out about this. I need to fix it, because if I do fix it, then it's time to freak out. But I can just go and fix this and we'll be okay.
Okay, so fundamentally crisis management or keeping the calm and keeping a communication line without being in panic or showing weakness or showing kind of creeping out with information.
Yeah, because people get emotional and they maybe start second guessing what they're supposed to do. And I'm someone who's like, okay, I've been through some bad situations, but if I followed the steps that I knew I was supposed to do, I always got out of it. And in some cases, some cases you have a playbook, some cases there's written down, in some cases you have to figure out what it is, but you still figure out what that next step is. And you just say, okay, this is all we're going to focus on right now. Let's not worry about the 30 other steps after that. Let's just worry about step A and get that done. And you get everyone kind of focused on their different steps. And then before you know it, you have it fixed. And then you can go around and figure out whose fault it is and what happened. But solving it's the most important part. And like I said, people who've been in stressful situations kind of tend to do that first and then worry about the dynamics later.
And has anything maybe that you learned from military background or things where you were trained on played against you?
Is there things that have played against me from my background?
Like stopped you, or mentality that you were used to that doesn't apply more in the corporate world? Like,
yeah,
the opposite aspect of like what has kind of aha moment or stop you? It's like, oh, that's not normal.
So as a human intelligence collector, I'm really big on people telling the truth, because my job to figure out are people telling me the truth or not. Whether it was source operations or interrogations, the whole goal is to get the truth, not just get someone to tell you what you want to hear, but actual truth. So I'm someone that's very focused on, okay, what's the actual truth? And when you go into the corporate world, and there's a lot of kind of white lies, and kind of you come into an organization and you're like, oh, when was your last audit? And they're like, oh, it was like last year. And you go and look at it and you're like, well, this wasn't really an audit. Or what's our vulnerability management system like? And like, oh, it's great. And you look at it, it's just, and so you kind of get used to some of the kind of white lies, and it takes you a minute to remember that, again, it's not people being maybe downright deceitful, but people, in the business world painting things in a better picture, which to me is not good, because I would rather know the actual truth so we can fix it. If you're going to tell me everything's okay and I believe you and it's not okay, then I think we have problems. I'd rather just hear, no, things aren't okay with this. We just did this access review. It turns out there's a bunch of privileges that have been being used that shouldn't have been. I would just rather hear that from my people than, oh, no, everything's fine. But that's kind of the norm. People are used to not wanting to bring up bad news and not wanting to be the messenger of bad news. So I spend a lot of time telling my people, look, you can tell me anything. You can tell me I'm wrong, I'm doing something wrong. You can tell me we've been breached right now, that we've lost. I mean, just tell me it, because I just want to know so we can fix it. I'm not going to ever yell at you or be upset with you because you told me the truth, especially if something that's serious. And that's something that in the business world, to be frankly honest, everyone kind of tries to paint everything in a lighter picture. And I don't like it. I would rather just tell me straight up, if my baby's ugly, my baby's ugly. If you don't like the way my sim rules work, tell me that. I don't need, I don't need sunshine and roses. I need like ground truth.
Right. And yeah, that's a little bit of a difficult approach in corporate. Have you found risk management and the risk management approach help you, or your ability to evaluate risk very quickly help you, or maybe being a drawback?
I think it has helped, because again, in human, we would do risk vulnerability assessments of site locations and places. So I got this kind of mentality of like, okay, let's go in, and what is the most probable ways people are going to try and go into a building or go into a classified area? And this isn't a secret. Social engineering is very effective. No one's going to try and blow a hole through the wall at Fort Knox if you can walk up with a clipboard and say the right things and be shuttled around like you're a maintenance guy. So, social engineering is a real legitimate thing, and kind of dealing with that in the military side, and then seeing how it's very common in the corporate and cyber world. I kind of saw like a lot of the different risks that I was used to evaluating for I'd have to plan for an operation like, hey, I got to go into Baghdad, I got to talk to a source. What's my risks on the route? What's my risk coming back? What are my risks on the site? This thinking about that holistic, it was a very normal thing for me. And so doing that with work is very much the same. Like, oh, we're going to roll out a new product. What are the risks while we roll it out? What are the risks when we set it up? What are the risks if we don't configure it right? What are the, just thinking about that and doing some gap analysis and threat assessments is almost second nature now. So it's something that I kind of probably dwell too much on. Every time we're doing something, I'm thinking like, okay, what are all the things I need to think about that might happen? But then you also think like it's also not super realistic that an APT is going to come after my private Gmail account. So, I may think about it maybe as a possibility, but it's gonna be really low on it. So I'm not going to worry as much about MFA on my throwaway Gmail account as much as my corporate account. A lot of people talk about MFA and social media. I'm one of those people that like, if someone stole my social media, it would suck, but it's not going to be the end of the world, really. There's really nothing on it. You're going to get a bunch of my workout videos. Congratulations. I'll just make more. I don't ever go back and look at them. Like, not the end of the world. But that's my own private, risk, analysis situation is I would rather just go on Twitter. I mean, I actually do have MFA set up, but some other things I don't necessarily think you need it for if you're willing to lose it. Because once you get into a world where you're constantly MFAing into everything that doesn't even matter, I feel like you start kind of going through the motions. You're not really focusing. That's how you can get tricked into allowing someone in your MFA, because you're hitting approve because you're so used to just approving things all the time as you're working. So I think there's a dichotomy there.
Yeah, no, I think that's a brilliant point. And we got some recently, and these podcasts will come out a little bit later than what we record, but a lot of scare tactic around device being hacked with just a single cable, or the FBI alerting that, be aware of that. We had our own drama here in the UK where people were scared about, having access to laptops, or laptop being left unattended.
Unattended on a train, right?
Yes, and my friend Daniel has raved about it.
And I agree with Daniel. Is it good to leave your laptop unattended on a train? No, it's not great. But is it likely that a hacker is going to be right there waiting for you to do something with it? Also not likely. So, I mean, there's just a give and take. I think especially in social media, when it comes to cybersec and infosec, people like to have really strong opinions about all the OPSEC you could have. And it's like, okay, this is really cool. And people take it to a really high degree. But once you've worked for the government and you've seen the level of OPSEC we have for things that are really important, you'd probably lower your own a little bit, because, we just saw, a 21-year-old airman from the Air National Guard was dropping TS secrets on Discord, and people are shocked. How is this even possible? People have no idea at the government level, at the military level, even the intelligence agencies levels. The level of OPSEC is not unreasonable. It has to be functional for all the people. The data can't be stored away where no one can see it. It can't be unusable. It's got to be accessible. And so, when people that aren't in that world, they're talking about, well, I have an anonymous Twitter account, and I don't post pictures, and I don't post things where you can find me. It's like, that's cool, but like, no one's looking for you. So you're really doing a lot of work for nothing.
Right. And I think that's a good point. People don't realize that military and government are organizations like anybody else, just with a risk and impact level that is much higher. But we had data breach and leaks, and maybe they're intentional, maybe they're not intentional,
Yeah.
but who knows? That's a different topic. But back on that topic, I think MFA, we talked offline a little bit on identities and how identity is possibly fundamentally broken, or we've been focusing a lot on the podcast and on our socials on risk-based vulnerability management, a lot on vulnerability. Application security is up, down, left, and right with this bomb and the recent regulation that the US government has issued. Are we missing one of the fundamental part of the application that we're building?
Yeah, I did really want to talk about that because I've been talking with a bunch of my colleagues lately about this. I've been talking, I started with Nathaniel when he went to the Gartner Summit. He's with Mesh Security, who I help advise. We were talking about how identity and context is just missing these days. And what I mean by that is we may get logs and we may get alerts around basic authentication and from tokens, users, hosts, whatever. But we're not getting enough context to make good decisions on if these are compromised, if they're legitimate, if they're not. And people say, yeah, we do. We have SIMs. But the reality is that SIMs are disparate log sources with different key value pairs that don't follow the same timelines. You may get a Windows Defender alert, and then 15 minutes later, when the Cloudflares finally come in, because there's millions of them, they're just not going to line up in the same 5-minute window. You can't have these real-time searches running all the time. Even if you have the biggest Splunk instance in the world with all the CPU and RAM and whatever you need, you can't have 1,000 concurrent searches just running. You only have a finite amount, and they can only be in a certain window. And we have really failed at getting identity right in a way where we actually know normal behavior and differentiate it from abnormal behavior in a way that lines up with the rest of the data. So it's one thing to have authentication logs, that's great, but you don't get the authentication logs along with all the other SaaS apps. And let's say you're SSOing to GCP and you're SSOing and all these other things. You may get a login here or there, but you're not getting that and the data from those tools and getting that correlated to see if that makes sense. And so the reason why I think we've got identity wrong is that we've got it built in a way where it doesn't really work well with other tools, and other tools aren't necessarily pulling it in to match with their data in a way that I think, really is effective. And so we can't really decide, or we can't really tell well when a user's credentials are compromised. We can't tell really well when a token's been stolen and man in the middle, when Evil 2 took a token and is just, stealing your session. And in the logs, you'll see like a failed, a pass, a failed. You can maybe have some alerts around that, but you could also, that could be a million false positives of people just fail and pass on basic authentication. So I feel like, products, vendors, whoever, all these different people need to start thinking about, we need to really get identity pulled out. We need to make it contextualized. We need to feed it into these tools in a way that's more integrated, better than we did with SIMs. And I SIMs are kind of going away in a way. They're still there, but people are kind of moving more to this XDR and some of these other cybersecurity mesh. Yeah, cybersecurity, for example, cybersecurity mesh architecture is a good example where this can work. It's very new. People don't really know exactly what it is, but it's an area where you can take this, your inventory, you can take your identity, you can take all these other different pieces and actually put them together with all the API calls in the cloud, plus API calls to all the tools that are working with your cloud, and actually get a comprehensive view of how your users interacting with all that. So I'll give you an example. I've got people, let's say I've got GCP, I've got GitLab, I've got Docker containers, I've got all these things in my pipeline. I don't see all that together. I see different alerts in GCP for authentication. I see Lacework showing me stuff in GCP, but I don't see the GitLab stuff where they SSO'd over and connected the two, and then the guy who pushed the merge request came from here and pushed it to this different project. None of that's all tied together in a way where I feel like it's coherent and effective in real time. And I think, again, the piece is missing is people aren't pulling in the identity piece and the contextual piece around it enough to enrich all the other things around it. Like I said, cybersecurity mesh architecture is one area where I think they're going to start to do this and do it very well, but it's not a huge field. There's not many people in it yet. And I don't know people have seen the value of it because people are thinking this is just another SIM. This is just another IDP. This is just an ITDR/DLP. I mean, it's many things, but at the basic fundamental level, I think what it's doing well is taking identity, it's adding the context we need a little bit better, And I think it's just an important thing we need to start talking about, because the longer we don't address this and we start building tools on top of identity on top of it, we're just going to keep having the same problem of the same password credentials being stolen and people just going right in the front door. They don't need a zero. You can just go right in with the credentials, and we have, or service accounts.
This episode is brought to you by the generosity of Phoenix Security Limited. Phoenix helps startups and enterprises solve complex software security supply chain visibility by leveraging the power of correlation and contextualization. Phoenix platform connects to your repositories, scanners, and cloud, correlates all the information, and provides you with a prioritized list of vulnerabilities that need to be addressed first. Discover how Phoenix Security helps CISOs and developers remove friction and maximize the use of DevSecOps professionals at phoenix.security. Phoenix Security. Correlate, contextualize, and act on risk with one click.
And that's actually a very good point. Sometimes we worry too much about a 0 day, but an all day or a 0 day is really expensive to use and burn, because once you burn it, it's out in the wild. People will start detecting, triggering, you burn it. It's really expensive. While stolen token or stolen authentication or stolen past the hash or whatever you want to call it, it's really cheap. It might be in some data breach. It is orchestratable in at scale. And that's where attackers have been focusing, I think, from my perception, more on stealing tokens from CI/CD, stealing tokens from specific users. MFA has helped so much, but as you rightfully said, when everything is MFA, then you lose the perception of what's legit and what's not legit. Like, if you keep on receiving MFA portal and authentication requests, you're not going to think twice, and you're just going to input it. And there might be a malicious MFA, and once you're there. Read it as Uber.
Yeah, and like we said earlier, social engineering is still the most effective, maybe not the most effective in all cases, but it's still a very effective means of getting someone to give up their credentials and other pieces about them that allow people to go into an environment purporting to be them, and people just are none the wiser. And because of my background, I take it a step further, where I've been doing research on ransomware groups. And I think it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be a huge trend, but it's going to be something where they're going to start trying to recruit people with placement access, because they're so commoditized. They've built this really great market for ransomware. It's very lucrative. In fact, Conti Group was, as revenue and margin wise, was better than the top EDR company in the world. They're making $180 million a year with $6 million in expenses. You try and beat that as an EDR company revenue, you're just not gonna. So it's a very effective model. And if their phishing campaigns don't work, they're just going to give up? They're just going to throw in the towel and be like, they have phishing tools that stop us. No, they're going to recruit people. They're going to start, and they have. I've looked up and I've listened to a couple interviews where people will email people in the company and try, hey, if you let us get in, or you give us your credentials, we'll give you like half the ransom. And this is very rudimentary. This isn't super.
There was ransomware as a service as well. Like you could register in a portal and say, like, if you ransom your own organization, we give you a piece of it.
Yes. And so I feel like this other piece, especially if we treat developers like mercenaries, and we continue to be in this like distributed world where technical people are all around the world and we've never even really met them. You think they're really loyal to us if someone's going to offer them a couple $1 million to install a small backdoor into some code, or just get them onto an SMH onto a box? Or these are not unreasonable things, and they're super easy. And again, we don't have good tools to pick up on that, because this is all happening outside of the network. If someone's going to recruit Bob from the IT team, they're probably going to send it to them through like LinkedIn or some other social media or whatever. They may send it to their corporate email. I doubt it. But it's just going to be in a non-visible way. Bob decides to do it and give us credentials or do whatever. You're not going to see it, because Bob's allowed to put things on the network. Bob's allowed to make configuration changes. Bob's allowed to do all these things. The only way you're going to know it's a difference is if you've got really good contextual, and I'm not going to say UBA because it's not like that. But you need some contextual and maybe a little bit of anomaly detection to say, like, you know what, Bob's never made a firewall change this time from this place or whatever, and this firewall change is weird. Like, we don't have anything that does that. We don't have anything that goes on Palo Alto and says, hey, someone just made a configuration change to any. You had a zero trust set up.
Like, it's very noisy. It's very noisy. You need to tweak it if your workforce change consistently. It was the whole discussion around behavioral-based analysis for IDP and so on versus, the traditional approach. And the one that is very effective but very noisy could be the behavioral approach, because as soon as you change the norm, is that an attack or is that not an attack? And then you become almost blind to that. But identity originally in the identity forum has been formulated in that exact way, so that enable behavioral changes and the division between what you can do, your permission from who you are. It's just complicated to think in that way, because you think an organization, you might have like rights across the board, right across like several identity store. And don't get me even started on coding this inside application, because then you need to take into account all the possible scenarios.
But what about this? Instead of having a Palo Alto alert that goes to some SIM that says Bob made a change, and then someone reviews it to see if it's good or not, what if you had an alert from some sort of like mesh architecture tool that says, hey, a previously unexposed asset is now open to the internet, and this is who made that change? Which alert would you look at immediately and go, oh, wait a minute, all of a sudden we have a newly exposed asset to the internet, and it was done by this change? You immediately think, okay, like either Bob made a mistake or Bob made a big mistake, but you'd probably remediate it, you'd investigate, you do all these things. But if you just got an alert that Bob made a change, and a Palo Alto, no idea if it might know if it's untrusted or trusted zone, so maybe that's in it. But it's not going to highlight the fact that, hey, you've got an internet-facing asset now. This is open to the world now. Like that needs to be highlighted and like very upfront. And I think that's where, again, mesh security, identifying the attack surface first, kind of bringing that like, hey, something really sensitive is now internet-facing, it's vulnerable, and these are the users involved in it. Like seeing it in that order, I think makes it much easier to prioritize and then possibly even filter out the false positives.
I guess so, but if you take it into a very dynamic, like DevSecOps world or DevOps world, where millions of things appear and disappear in a very ephemeral way, it's very difficult even to trace who deployed which asset to where. Like what was the CI/CD that deployed that particular asset? Like even tracing who owns the asset is insane.
Yeah, you go look at the logs and it says GitLab user did it, and you're like, no, come on, it wasn't GitLab user.
And then you need to pivot on the hash, and then the hash, you need to look at the commit, and then in Git, it's insanely impossible. And the best way of seeing is like if you force everybody to actually use tags in the Terraform or CloudForm, so at least you have some form of level of ownership. And that's just one of the problems, like just on the assets.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I think we need to start getting that identity pulled out, correlate a little bit better, kind of bubble it up to the surface, so we start seeing that a little bit more. But
you're seeing the service mesh picking up, or is one of our dream?
I think we're going to see more out of mesh. I think it's something that it takes quite a bit of time to create all the different integrations. Obviously all these different tools that are providing information kind of speak different languages, so you have to normalize that. But once we're kind of done with that, or once we start doing it in a way where it's, we have some sort of common language, some, identity query, language or whatnot, I think it'll make it a bit easier. And I think, it's just a matter of time before we get there.
Brilliant. And I want to touch quickly on maybe how identity then gets insanely complicated in blockchain and the whole digital world, because that's more the world that you live. And I think it's not talked a lot. And with the the UK is rolling out digital currency, or potentially rolling out digital currency. The US is thinking as well. We had Bitcoin, we had all the rest of digital currency. How complicated it is to maintain a digital identity or a key?
So identity is a big problem for blockchain, in my opinion. And the reason why, and this is my opinion, so there will probably be many dissenting opinions, but the original image and the visual dream of blockchain was this very anonymous, decentralized, fair, just because you've got an important name, you don't get any more rights than anyone else in this kind of little ecosystem. So it had this very pure, very, I would say, normally good intent of let's remove the identity from it. Let's just have just a key and a private key. Everything's very transactional. The math kind of sorts everything out, and then it's very fair. And it sounds great on paper, but the problem is we're humans. And humans are not good at things like keeping private keys. If you look at most of the hacks, 50% of them were a compromised private key. Now, these are corporations, exchanges, distributed finance apps where this happened. And we're going to start asking individual users, like the user base, the world, to start holding private keys to hold their own digital dollars. Like, this is just not realistic. Like
digital wallets.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and FedNow from the Central Bank of New York is coming out in June or July. That's going to be an early version of a digital dollar from a central bank. And I don't know, I haven't seen it or heard how they're going to do it. But again, if it goes down to people having to keep private keys, this is just going to be very problematic. Because we lose them. There's one thing we've learned from cryptocurrencies is there's been a lot of Bitcoin that's lost forever because people had a private key in a computer they threw away and Bitcoin wasn't worth anything. And then all of a sudden it was worth $20,000 and they're jumping into dumpsters trying to find their old hard drives. B, they can be stolen pretty easily because there's no, I mean, I don't want to say there's no tools, but there's no consumer tools that are really good at keeping your private keys safe and easily accessible to work with. But it's just not in my opinion, it's just not a good way of proving identity for your money, your wealth, your like all of stuff. It's just, it's too clinky, it's too kludgy. And with a lot of these projects, especially distributed public blockchains, there's no one you can call if you screw it up. You give someone access to your wallet and they take all your money, it's gone. You lose your key and your seeds, your whatever, it's gone. Whereas, again, people aren't going to be like this, but a private blockchain is what's going to happen because this is what the government's going to do. And if someone says, hey, I lost all my money, they can say, well, we're going to burn it and we're going to reissue it because we've got the records of what you had and what you don't have, and then you just have what you have. And that kind of loses the kind of essence of what blockchain was supposed to be, but that provides consumers with a level of protection that they actually need. I mean, look at the banking situation. We have to insure a certain amount of money. Banks can fail. If you're telling people to trust their money to a distributed blockchain where there's no one ultimately responsible for it, and they're solely responsible for keeping their identity secured and in a way where they can interact with it, and if they screw it up, they're on their own, who's going to put their money into that?
Exactly. Like right now we have digital currency and digital dollar. It's just called credit cards, and credit cards company are accountable for it.
Yeah, and the main reason, and so it's basically the same when you think about that, but the difference with them going to like a blockchain smart contract type of system is that they can auto have taxes taken out of every transaction. So this is why it's so attractive to governments. You won't even need much of the IRS anymore because every transaction will automatically have the right amount of taxes taken out. You can use stimulus checks where, hey, for the next 2 weeks, everyone gets $200, but you have 2 weeks to spend it. You can only spend it at grocery stores and it'll just work. You can kind of set up those parameters and it's the only place you can use it. And after the other 2 weeks, it's burned, it's gone. You can seize people's monies way easier. Like the money laundering that we're all worried about right now will be just gone because they'll see every transaction. And my concerns around it are the data privacy piece. If let's say is every citizen going to have 100 wallets, or they're going to have 1 or 2 wallets? Well, if your wallet's public, people query it, then they figure out anything about, if they know you just went and bought a Tesla, and then they see the public wallet for Tesla, and they see all the wallets that bought Tesla, and they know the price of yours, they can figure out your wallet address and they can see everything you've bought.
OPSEC becomes so much easier, and you don't have to steal laptops, and you don't need to be even in the same train to know all your history.
California is doing this thing where you can get your marriage certificate, your birth certificate, all these different things via blockchain, so via self-service. Again, everyone thinks it's pseudo-anonymous, but the reality is that how many people die on any given day? How many people are born on any given day? How many people are married on any given day in California? It's statistically pretty easy to figure out whose wallet is associated with requesting their birth certificate, death certificate, or marriage certificate. And then based on the file size and the metadata, because those wallets are going to be different and the actual file attached to them is going to be different sizes, statistical analysis is going to be able to tell exactly who's getting all those things. And so That's the one piece of this blockchain piece that I'm really concerned about, aside from government control, is with data analysis, everyone's spending habits will be completely accessible if we're going to continue down this public blockchain idea.
And it's not different. It's not very hard right now with large language models to actually pull all these data and say, okay, can you correlate all this stuff for me?
Yeah, I mean, it used to be people thought you could take Bitcoin, you send it through a tumbler, and then you get it out the other side and it's untraceable. But with enough data points and enough compute, you can still figure it out based on the sizes. They can reconstitute, okay, 100 million came in this side and 101 millions came out the other side. They can still figure out where those are. And then they connect the connection, and they can still trace it.
Brilliant. But we're almost at the end of our podcast, and we talked a lot about doom. Let's and gloom. Let's talk about more on the positive side, on the leap that we've done on digital currency, on our whole industry, that we got more secure, so that attacker find hard walls and need to really breach in. But what would be your message, your positive message to close the podcast, Chris?
Well, I would say to everyone that's trying to get into the field or has been in the field for a while, if you don't feel like we've made some ground in the last 5 years, then you should take a step back and think about some of the problems we had 5 years ago. We have problems still, and there's still breaches, but we're dealing with so many more complex issues now. Feel like we're much more prepared than we've ever been. Again, if you just look at the bad news, it's the ransomware attack every other day, so we get down on ourselves. It's just a matter of time. But we didn't used to have an application for every company even 5 years ago. Now you get a toaster and app with it. There is so much going on right now. There is so much online, so many data, so many apps. And if you took the percentage of things going on, we're doing okay. We're doing okay securing things. And I see maturity in products and programs. I see the community discussing a lot of things online, sharing best practices. And I feel like it's a lot more inclusive and diverse than it's ever been. And that, to me, it tells me that we may not ever completely eradicate crime and cybercrime, whatever, but we're coming to the table with a good team, and we're approaching it with a lot of different angles, a lot of different thoughts, a lot of different points of view. And I feel good about where we are there compared to even 5-10 years ago.
Brilliant. And I think that's a very good positive message to conclude on. Thank you, Chris, for coming on the show. It's been a brilliant conversation. If people want to find more about you, what you do, where you write, where can they find you?
So I guess the easiest would be my Twitter, which is Crooster, CROOSTER. And then on there, there's some links to like my GitHub, which is the same thing. I post some talks and links and things on there. But also hit me up on LinkedIn. People think I'm some sort of like, probably, because of my lifting stuff, I'm sort of like mean or not approachable, but I'm actually a nice guy. So if you ask for some advice or some help, I'll usually stop and answer as best I can. So feel free to reach out with anything.
Believe me, the lifter are probably the most gentle souls on earth.
Yeah.
Brilliant. And all the links will be on the show. But Chris, thank you very much for coming on the show. And everybody, please get hold of your wallet. Please take care of your identities. Please don't get crazy on MFA and securing everything. And we hope that this show was useful for you and you got some positive insight and some good positive news as well, that we're getting better every time. Thank you very much, Chris, and everybody. Stay safe out there, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Please leave us a review on Apple Podcast and post it on social media tagging Cybersecurity Cloud Podcast for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Discover other episodes at www.cybersecuritypodcast.com.